that we worship, the good and beautiful God. And I want to continue with that this morning and ask this question. If you've got your Bibles, you can get them ready. If you don't, they'll be on the screen behind me, the verses that we'll be looking at. Somebody asked famous theologian R.C. Sproul this question, and the question was, what's the greatest spiritual need in the world today? What's the greatest spiritual need in the world today? And without hesitating, R.C. Sproul said, the greatest need in people's lives is to understand the true identity of God. Not what they imagine Him to be like, not what they've heard that He's like, not what they've seen in popular expressions in the media Him to be like, but what is He really like? Because a lot of people reject faith based on what they've heard He's like. They've rejected. If that's who God is, then I don't want to have anything to do with that God. They just dismiss Him out of hand. I have some friends that I'm in constant contact with that have completely rejected God. They're atheists of atheists. I've never known very many atheists. I have 2 in my world right now. And there's hardly anything I can say that can convince them otherwise. But that's not your problem, because you're here. So you're not an atheist, right? Right? I mean, if you're an atheist and you're here, God bless you, but why? You know, there's other things to do on a Sunday morning, as a lot of non-atheists are experiencing right now. So there was a follow-up question to Sproul, and the same question was that. It was, what's the greatest spiritual need in the lives of church people, of believers? And here's what he said: to understand the true identity of God. It's the same. Because if believers really understood who our God is, what's in His heart, how competent He is, what His character is like, it would change their lives. It would change what they say. If they really understood who God is, it would change the way they thought. It would change their attitudes. It would change the way they interacted with people. Now listen, wake your neighbor up. This is the most important thesis of the day. Our greatest problem, your greatest problem is your imagination about who God is. What causes your behavioral difficulties, what causes your insecurities, what causes your fears is an inaccurate understanding of who God is. If you really knew who God was, it would change everything. And so why I'm pressing this so harsh and so fervently, and over the last several weeks, and we've still got a few to go, is because it just is mind-blowing to me. Because I hear people say this all the time. Well, my idea of God is, and then they describe Him. And I think, well, where did you get that idea? It's just the way I think of God. It really doesn't matter what you think of God. It doesn't really matter what I think of God. What matters is, what does the Bible say is true about God? We don't get to make Him up. Now, to get our heads around this, we have to go back to the beginning of everything. And so let's go to Genesis. Genesis chapter 3 is kind of where I'm going to start. And if you want to write down some notes, you can on your bulletin there if you like. But the first thing I want us to go all the way back to the very beginning and get our heads around this whole idea of what God is up to in this world. What kind of God is this that we serve, this good and beautiful God? And we go to the beginning and we see where God has this interaction with the people that He had created, Adam and Eve. And in Genesis chapter 2, it says that the Lord commanded the man, you are free to eat of any tree, how many? Any tree in the garden, any of them, except one. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it, you'll certainly die. Now, a lot of people misunderstand this. They think that what this means is that God is not in favor of moral discernment. That He wants to keep hidden the idea that mankind can figure out what's right and what's wrong. But that's not really what He's talking about here. What He's talking about is this idea, that if you eat of this tree of the knowledge of good and evil, what you're really saying is that now I get to decide what's good and evil. And there's a big difference. If I get to decide what's right and what's wrong, then I don't need God. So to eat of the fruit of the tree of the good, of the knowledge of good and evil is not that you'll have your eyes open and now you'll get to see what God sees. It's that now by eating of that fruit, you get to decide what's right and what's wrong, and you get to take the place of God. That's the sin. I don't need to worry about making my life fit in with the way things are designed to be in the garden. I get to be my own God. I get to decide what's right. I get to decide what's wrong. And what's wrong for me may not be wrong for you. And what's right for me may not be right for you. And I shouldn't try to impose my morality on you, and you shouldn't try to impose your morality on me. I get to decide. I get to be my own God. And God quite graciously here is allowing man the freedom to choose. You can choose to be that way, or you can choose to live in my design. It's your choice. That's grace. I mean, he didn't have to give us a choice, but he did. If you don't want to live in community with me, you don't have to. If you don't want me to be your God, you don't have to be. If you want to be your own God, you can be. And then this tempter comes along, kind of symbolized and personified by this slithering snake. And this tempter comes along, and he comes to the woman. Now, when God initially gives the command, do you know who he gives the command to? Who does he give the command to? He gives it to Adam, the man. Man is the only one present to hear this prohibition about eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But the tempter comes to the woman. And so we're supposed to understand that the woman is to get her information about what God said from the man. But here's the question just for the women in the room. How many have ever had a situation where the man does not give a fully detailed account of a conversation he had with somebody very important? Has that ever occurred to any ladies in the room? Is it possible that Adam just conveniently kind of left out a detail or two? Could be. Here's the serpent, though. The serpent is going after the one who's not directly present to hear the words from God's mouth, but hears it secondhand. And it's quite a long conversation if you go back and read it. And what he does, and what the serpent does so skillfully, is he doesn't call God a liar. He implies that God is a liar. He just asks Eve to just doubt a little bit. God's really not going to kill you. Come on. He just made you. Is God going to kill you if you eat of this fruit? That's not going to happen. You know better than that. Don't be naive. He just doesn't want you to be like him. And so Eve starts to process this. Did God really say that you can't eat of any tree? I mean, he says you're not supposed to eat of any tree, and that's not what God said. God actually didn't say of any tree. He said you could eat of any tree but one. And so there's this misquote that the devil does of litigious proportions. And what really is at the heart of temptation is this. Listen carefully. It's this. And it's what we all battle with. I can't really trust God to look out after my best interest. I've got to step in. I can't really trust God to meet all my needs. I have to step in and do something. I mean, I know he's there, I know he's real and all of that, but I can't really trust him to make me feel secure. I can't really trust him to make me feel ultimately loved, and so I have to add on all this other stuff. I got to look out for myself. Eventually, this woman gives in, eats from this tree, and she gives some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it, and then the eyes of both of them were opened. And this is the way temptation works. There is a value, there is something I believe, and then I'm tempted to violate it, and that temptation looks so good, it looks so sweet ahead of time, and then when I do, the guilt comes in, and the shame comes in, and it's almost unbearable. So in the fall, something happens. Adam and Eve partook of this fruit. And something happened. An infection happened, not just in their hearts, but in all of creation. It's called the fall. You've heard this before. There's a word that I want to introduce to you. It's a word that you don't hear a lot of in today's culture, but it's the word depravity. And let me just kind of introduce that word to some of you for the first time maybe, or remind some of you what it means. But depravity, you notice it's in red, you know it's bold, you know it's loud, because depravity is a huge issue. What happens to the human heart is this. Because of sin, we are born into this world with a desire to have our own way. Now, we've had some precious babies in the congregation this morning, and it's really hard for me to say what I'm about to say because they're so innocent and they're so beautiful and all that. But those babies have only one thing in mind right now, and that is what they want, when they want it, exactly how much they want. They're not unselfish little beings. They're beautiful little beings. I'm just telling you, they're beautiful. I held my grandson last night, just a few months old. Beautiful little boy. It's one of the prettiest little boys I've ever seen in my life. But that little boy is living for himself right now. He's not living for anybody but himself. And in fact, if you'll notice this about children, you have to teach children to share. It's natural for them to want to be kind of clutchers. It's natural for them to want to have their own toys. You have to say, no, little one, you have to learn to share. We have to civilize them by teaching them that others are important as well. It's depravity. We're born with it. It's infectious. It's contagious. It's congenital. Just like a glass is predisposed to shatter, just like a nitroglycerin is predisposed to explode, I am predisposed to do something wrong. That's just the way I am. When I think it's necessary for me to get what I want or to avoid something that I want to avoid, I will lie, I will gossip, I will cheat, I will slander, I will covet, I will hate, and that's in me. And I'm the preacher. Can you imagine what's in some of you? I'm serious. This is a bad deal. We have this thing called depravity, and it's inside of us. Most of the mess in our world is this problem called depravity. And so, here's what's going on in Genesis. God creates everything perfect. It's a beautiful setting. It's a beautiful situation. He makes a human being in His own image, and then they decide they would rather have themselves for God rather than God, and so they fall. And when they fall, their eyes are opened, and there's this alienation, and now there's a separation between Adam and Eve and God that had never occurred before. And the Scripture says in Genesis 3, verse 8, it says, "The man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and they hid from the Lord among the trees of the garden. But the Lord called to the man, 'Where are you?' And he answered, 'I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid.'" First time in human history has anybody ever been afraid. First time anybody has ever been afraid of anything. And who is man afraid of? He's afraid of God. I was naked, and so I hid. And he said, "Who told you that you were naked?" This is the first time that's ever come up as well. "Have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you to not eat from?" And the man said, "The woman you put here with me, she gave me some fruit from the tree and I ate it." Whose idea was this woman anyway? Right? This is Adam's thinking. I know it is because I've thought this a few times myself. Things were going pretty well here, God, just me and the animals. And then she wasn't my idea. You look down here and you put her on me here. And see, now we don't have any of this poetry quoting anymore. No more bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, let's all sing together. No, it's now this woman you gave me. It's not my fault. So there's this blaming thing. So, do you think, by the way, this is the last time a married couple will ever blame one another for troubles? It starts right here. And so where do they go? God says, this can't be. You can't be in the garden anymore. And so the Scripture says they have to leave the garden. They have to leave the presence. They have to leave the purity of God's presence. And so where do they go? They go east. They have to go east. East of Eden. And that's not just the title of a Steinbeck novel. You understand that it's also not just geography. Israel was bounded to the west by the Mediterranean Sea. And the east is where their enemies were. East is the place of danger. East is the place of alienation. East is away from God. But before they do, God makes a promise. Listen carefully. He makes a promise. He says to this woman in verse 15, "I will put enmity between you." He's talking about to the serpent at this point. He's talking about to the person who symbolizes the evil one. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. And that offspring that's coming will crush your head, but you'll only strike his heel. And this is a prophecy about the coming offspring of Eve who will one day fix everything that's gone wrong. In other words, temptation, guilt, and death are going to meet their match in one person one day. And his name is Jesus. And so mankind falls. But then God, through this little prophecy, starts to redeem. There's sort of a redemption factor going on here. Another little redemptive note from God is that we're told that Adam and Eve are naked and now are ashamed. In chapter 3, verse 21, the Lord made them garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them. Where did that come from? It's an amazing thing to me. God saw their nakedness, and rather than allow them to just pull leaves off of trees, God, who created everything with a word, condescends to becoming a tailor. And he slays an animal, and he sews together some skins. And it's the first expression in all of the Bible, in all the history of the world, that innocent blood was shed because some man or some woman did something wrong. And it's an indication of how something has to be done about this sin that's been occurred. And so God covers them, and God is giving a foreshadow a little bit about what's coming, about the need for redemption and the need for blood to be shed. Adam and Eve have got to be wondering now as they leave Eden and they pack their bags and they're finding a place outside of the Eden, east of Eden. They've got to wonder, is God so put out with us right now that he'll never allow the human race to flourish? Well, was this the end of it? And you would think that. I mean, if you get kicked out of the place, you wonder if God's just done. He's just said, I don't want to have anything to do with them. But he sews these skins, and then he sends them east. And then one day, Eve starts to get a little nauseous. She can't hold things down. And she starts to have cravings for peanut butter and pickles and stuff. And Adam looks at her and says, Eve, you look like you're putting on a little weight. Which, again, not a smart thing to say. I'm going to have to kill a bigger animal just to cover. And what's happened here is what's going on is Eve is now, she's what? She's pregnant. She's pregnant with Cain. And all of a sudden, they must have thought, God's not finished with us. God's not finished with us. He wants the race to continue. He wants humanity to continue. And so Cain is born into the world. And it must have been every time they saw Cain, they were reminded that God wasn't finished with them, that God hadn't written them off. And then another baby is born into the world, Abel, and Abel's born. And everything was just perfect after that. They all lived happily ever after. Is this how the story goes? Those of you who know the story, what happens next? All of a sudden, Cain and Abel are quarreling. They grow up and they're fighting. It's not good. In chapter 4, verse 1, it says that she gave birth to Cain. And she says, and with the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man. By the way, I did notice in that there's no mention about the husband having any involvement in it at all. This is also typical of women to this day. They give birth and they mention God a lot, but they don't express a lot of appreciation for their husbands. As I remember it. So here's Abel and Cain. They've grown up. They're not getting along. And God wants to have a word with Cain because he sees something happening in Cain's life. Have you ever had an experience where you see something kind of creeping up or growing in the heart of a brother or sister or a friend, and you know they're headed for something that they shouldn't be headed for, and you wanted to say something to them just to say, hey, I'm a little concerned about something that I see, and maybe you should have you ever had that experience? And maybe you're sitting beside the person right now. You see something in their life, and you think, I need to say something about that path they're on. Well, this is what God is doing. God sees something in Cain's life. He sees this anger, this boiling between he and Abel. And so God actually does say something. He comes to Cain, and he says in chapter 4, verse 6, he says, the Lord said to Cain, why are you so angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what's right, you'll get accepted. But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door and it desires to have you, but you must rule over it. You need to get a grip on this. You need to get a grip on this. Now, this is another one of those firsts in human history. When God created everything, what did he do to create everything? What did he have to do? What did he do? He just spoke. Let there be light, and there was light. Let there be land, and there was land. Here, I mean, he is so effortless. He just has to speak the words, and things happen. Here, he's talking with a human being. He's talking with Cain, and he's speaking. He's saying things. He's saying, watch out. Don't do it. Calm your heart. Get a grip on this. Sin's crouching at the door. God's speaking. And what does Cain do? Cain ignores him, and Cain kills his brother Abel. Now God speaks, and it is not so. And Cain kills Abel, and the descent is getting worse. And Adam and Eve, they have to be tempted to do something wrong. That's what they have to do. Cain is not only tempted, God's actually trying to talk him out of doing the wrong, and he won't listen. Adam and Eve, their sin is defined by eating of fruit. With Cain, it's murder and hatred. And so in verse 16 of chapter 4, so Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod. Where? East of Eden. Further from community, further from the presence of God. Cain's scared though now. He's scared somebody's going to kill him because Cain has brought murder onto the planet. Cain has brought murder now into the human race. And so God does something else redemptive. God places on him a mark. It becomes known as the mark of Cain. It's a mysterious mark, don't really know what it is. But the idea is that it's supposed to warn the human race against violence and murder. It's supposed to serve as a warning that when you see this, be reminded that this is not a good thing. But among that also, it was a mark served to protect Cain from blood vengeance, from retribution. Maybe when people see this mark, God thinks, maybe when people see and hear this story, they will learn and they will not be so violent and they will not be so self-oriented. Maybe brothers will not hate each other, and God works to bring something good. Even in that mark, he's trying to show them that there's another way, but things keep getting worse. And in chapter 6, verse 11, it says, now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. There wasn't just isolated violence, it was full of violence. And God saw that it was ruined. It was ruined. What? The earth. It was ruined. Man, listen to that language. If you were here a few weeks ago, we talked about this language in the first chapter or two of Genesis. And God saw, and it was what? It was good. And God saw, and it was good. And God saw, and it was good. It's like this poetic refrain that keeps getting played over and over and over again in the first two chapters of Genesis. And here we see, and God saw, and it was ruined. How heartbreaking this is for God. And his heart was deeply troubled. Now, you think about your heart and your life. Somebody you love, and they mess up, and your heart's broken for them. Then you think about the heart of God, who loves every human being way more than you and I do from the beginning of time. He loves everybody whose heart is broken by everyone who goes down a wrong and self-destructive path. How much pain must be in the heart of God? I can't even imagine what that's like. I have a few people in my world, just a handful of people, and I see the path they're on, and they're on a path of destruction. How many of you know somebody on a path of destruction? Either in a marriage, in a life, they're just drugs. I mean, they're on a path, and you're going, if you don't get off that path, it's going over a cliff. You've got people like that. Imagine God, who created all of humanity, seeing humanity on a path that's leading over a cliff. It's bad. And God says, I can't let this continue. And so he sends a flood. But even in the flood, he sees a family, a man. His name is Noah. And one more time, there's this little grace note where God, even though he sees all the violence on the earth, instead of withdrawing from it, instead of removing himself instead of destroying it all, God connects himself or binds himself to the human race by making a promise to Noah and his family. And in that promise, he says, I will never again destroy the earth this way. And I'm going to make a sign that will remind all people that I am a redemptive God. And I'm going to remind you of this covenant, this promise. Anybody remember what that sign was? It's a rainbow. It's a rainbow. And God thinks maybe when people see the rainbow, they'll remember that this is a redemptive God. This is a God who is full of grace and full of truth. This is a God who wants them to turn from their violent ways. But they don't get it. It gets worse, and it gets worse, and it gets worse. And as we see in chapter 11 of Genesis, the people move, do you see it? The people move which direction? Eastward. The people are now moving eastward. It's not like God's driving them east. The people are on a path. They say, hey, let's go east. Let's just go east. There's an idea. And so the people are moving eastward, and they found a plain, and they settled there, and they said to each other, come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. And they used bricks instead of stone. And they said, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the earth. All of this is just incredibly loaded language. God had said initially that he wanted to create humanity so that they would have dominion over all of the earth. They were to scatter out all the earth, and now all these people are trying to gather in one place. And they don't have to do this. They don't. They're disobeying God. They don't want to honor the name of God. They want to make a name for themselves. They want to build something that will take them up into the heavens so that they will be like God. It's all about that. They're not going to bend their knee to God. They're going to build an edifice that can take them to God, or take them up to where the gods live, if you will. They don't want to. They want to occupy a place that only belongs to God. And it says, and then we will be like God. It's the same old sin. It's the sin that Adam and Eve did in the garden, just on a grander scale. And they get puffed up with what they're able to do, because they're able to build a pretty significant tower. But there's a very profound little verse, chapter 11, verse 5. Look at what it says. But then the Lord came where? Came down to see. This is trying to show the gap between man and God. God has to even come down to see their big tower. You see that? They're going to build it up to heaven, but God has to come down to see what they're doing. And then he realizes that the capacity of human evil and violence, if it goes unchecked, they're going to destroy themselves. And so he restrains them. He breaks this party up, and he scatters them out throughout the entire earth by giving them different languages, a further loss of community. And that's the end of chapter 11. I mean, this is a sad story. How many of you feel like this is a pretty sad story? I mean, God does a beautiful thing, and then they blow it. And then God does a kind of a redemptive thing, and then they blow it. And then God does another redemptive thing, and then they blow it. And God does another redemptive thing, and they blow it. And it's just this constant spiral down. And you get to the end of chapter 11, which is the prologue of Genesis, and you think, is this it? I mean, if you were just had that, you'd think this is the saddest, tragic story in ancient literature. That God started with such great promise, and then it ends with such a terrible, terrible situation. And if you were reading Genesis 1 through 11 for the first time, you would pick up on these themes, and you would start to wonder, is this it? Has God given up? And I've thought about this week as I processed this and wrote around on this sermon a little bit, that I know that this is my life. It's the story of my life. And it's the story of yours. If you think about it. You remember when you gave your heart to Christ? Do you remember that, Charlene? Do you remember when you gave your heart to Christ and you had that moment where God just redeemed you, and you had this, and then life comes along, and then you start to drift, and then you drift down, and then God brings somebody along and some act of kindness or maybe some word of confrontation, and you kind of repent and you move back towards God and part of his community, and then you do, and you just keep that circle, and you keep that cycle, and you keep that cycle, and sometimes you just get so far, and you wonder, how did I get here? And I look at this pattern, and I say, this is my pattern, and this is the pattern of a lot of people I know. This is the pattern of everybody I know, if I actually thought about it. But chapter 12 comes along. And in chapter 12, we have this beautiful story where God's going to take a man named Abram. He's going to change his name to Abraham, just an ordinary man, who lives in the land of Ur of the Chaldees, which was significantly east. Over by Baghdad, over in Iraq. That's where Ur was. He takes Abraham and says, I want you to go west. Are you getting this? I want you to go west. I'm pulling you out of Iraq. I'm pulling you out of Iran. I want you to travel across the Fertile Crescent, and I want to bring you to the land of promise. I'm going to bring you back. He makes this promise with Abraham. He said, I'm going to make a great nation from you. I'm going to make a promise with you. And you're going to have a people, we're going to call that people Israel, because the dream isn't dead. I'm going to redeem the human race. And throughout the Bible then, over and over again, there's a promise similar to this one in Exodus 6:6, where the scripture says that God says, I am the Lord, and I will free you from being slaves. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm. I will take you as my own people. I will be your God. And that theme is threaded throughout the rest of the Bible. So much so that one day Job even says in Job 19, I know my Redeemer lives. Because that's what I need. I need redemption. And that's what you need. I don't need more intelligence. I don't need a little more cleverness. I don't need a little more strength. I need a Redeemer. Because I am like Adam. I am like Cain. And I have tried to do my Tower of Babel. And then comes this promise of redemption. It comes from someplace beyond me. I can't do it. Because the whole point of the prologue to Genesis is to say that God hasn't given up on anybody yet. As has been said already today, as Josh has said it and others have said it, we still have a miracle working God. He's not given up on anybody yet. One day in the fullness of time, God sent a Redeemer. And here's the thing about redemption. There always has to be a price to be paid. There always has to be a price to be paid for redemption. I was thinking about this week, and I want you to I want to ask you to turn to the person next to you and ask this question, or you guys discuss it amongst yourselves. I want you to guess at something, all right? This will take you back. If you weren't born in the 60s, or if you don't remember that far back, then you can continue to sleep a little bit here if you want to. But back in the 60s, I want to ask this question. What was the largest single publication available in the U.S. during the 1960s? The largest single publication available to the masses in the 1960s. I'll give you 30 seconds. Turn to somebody beside you and see if you can come up with the answer. I see Chris and Evan back here looking at each other and going, I don't know. I don't watch the History Channel. I don't know. All right. Anybody want to guess? What is it? The Bible. The Bible? No. Well, no. Yeah, it's a good answer, but it's not true. Time Magazine? Anybody else? Saturday Evening Post? Anybody else? None of these are right. TV Guide? No, not true. Life Magazine? No. Playboy? Really? Who said that? Hazel, did you say Playboy? Blame it on your mom. Wow. No. Here it is. Here it is. This is the truth. It was a catalog called Speary and Hutchinson. Right? So I did a little research. How many remember S&H green stamps? All right. I had no idea this was so big. S&H printed, listen to this. You remember the stamps? I remember the stamps. You go to the grocery store, and after you paid your money, there was a little machine up at the top, and they would put in, and they would do a dial like you do an old telephone, and out came all these stamps. Do you remember this? Yeah. And my mother collected these things, and we had books and books and books and books of these things. But here's how big it was. S&H printed 3 times more stamps in the entire United States government than the entire U.S. Post Office did. That's a lot of stamps. They publish enough catalogs to more than circle all the way around the globe. Now, why did they get excited about these catalogs? Because they were stamps. And they weren't just stamps. You could save up these stamps. And what could you get with some of these stamps? A toaster. You could get an appliance if you saved up enough of them, couldn't you? I mean, this is incredible. Even some of the research I found this week said this. There was a school in Erie, Pennsylvania that saved 5.4 million green stamps, and they bought 2 gorillas for a local zoo with green stamps. Can you imagine? But these were stamps, but they weren't just any stamps. These were green stamps, and you could take them to a special place called a redemption center. A redemption center. You remember this, don't you? You go to the redemption center, and there's where you could get your toaster, and you could get in dishes and all kinds of stuff. I remember going there. You could redeem these stamps for something wonderful. These stamps could be redeemed. By the way, did you know S&H is still around? Really? You can go online right now. They don't offer stamps, they offer green points. And you can still redeem your S&H green stamps. So if you've got some in an attic someplace, it's not too late. You can redeem them. All right. With endless patience and at infinite cost to himself, God has been waiting since the beginning of history, watching, aching, loving, until one day, in the fullness of time, there came to this earth an offspring of Eve. And God sent him to a redemption center called Calvary. And there's only one item on God's catalog, only one. He says, I want one of you. I'll take one of you, one of you, one of you. That's all he wants. Paul says in Colossians, for he has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and has brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. There is a redemption center. And so God says now that he has been saying to the human race for thousands of years, why don't you just come on into the redemption center? This is what Josh was talking about earlier. Why don't you just come on into the redemption center? Why don't you trade that old guilt, it's not getting you anywhere anyway, for a little bit of forgiveness? Why don't you trade your old sinful life, which will never get you what you want, for a redeemed life? Why don't you trade your regret for some hope? Why don't you trade your despair for some faith? Why don't you trade that human inadequacy for some power of God that still works miracles? Why would God make a trade like that? Because somebody's paid a price. There was a Redeemer. Because the story of the world that we can barely allow ourselves to hope for is true, that God who created everything, who started everything, is involved in restoring everything and redeeming everything. God says no matter what you've done to your life, on the outside with your physical body or the inside with your soul, you bring it to me and I can fix it. You bring it to the redemption center because I've already paid the price. That's our God. That's the God that Jesus fell in love with. Schindler's List is one of my favorite movies. Very hard to watch, but it's important to watch. I tried to find the movie this week, and even this morning, couldn't find it. I don't know why, but I just couldn't find it. But there's a scene in it that, on a human level, helps to describe what I've been trying to share with you this morning. And I want to try to recount for you a little bit of the language that was going on. If you remember the Schindler's List story, true story, Oskar Schindler was a businessman and he was pretty wealthy, and he created a program that he could sneak Jews out of Germany so that they would not be murdered. And he had all underground, and he would make lots of money, and he would buy things. He would buy the Jews their passage by paying off corrupt Nazi officials. Towards the end of the movie, Schindler is standing there, Liam Neeson, and he's standing there with Stern, who is his helper in all this, and then surrounded by a lot of Jewish faces. And Schindler says to himself, as he looks at all those faces, he says, I could have got out more. And Stern isn't sure he heard right, and so he steps away from him and from his wife and from the car and from the co-workers. He moves towards Schindler and he says, what did you say? And Schindler says, I could have got out more. If I don't know, if I could have sold more. And then Stern says, Oscar, there are 1,200 people who are alive because of you. Look at them. And he can't look at them. He's filled with shame. Schindler says, if I had more money, I threw away so much money. You have no idea the money I threw away. And Stern says, there will be generations who will live because of what you've done. And Schindler says, I didn't do enough. And Stern says, you did so much. And then Schindler starts to lose it, and tears start to come down his face, and then Stern's, and they embrace. And then the look on Schindler's face as his eyes sweep across the faces of those workers is one of apology, of begging for them to forgive him for not doing enough. And then Schindler goes over to his car, and he says, I could have sold this car. He would have bought it. Why did I keep the car? 10 people. This car would have got 10 people out. And then I could have got more. And he looks around, then he pulls a pin off of his lapel and he rips it off and he holds it out pathetically to Stern. He says, this is 2 people. This is 2 Jews. This is 2 people. He could have given me at least 2 more. 1 more. 1 more. I could have got 1 more person out. And I didn't. I can't watch that movie without just thinking of Jesus, thinking of God, thinking of the heart of a Redeemer. What a mess our world is in, ladies and gentlemen. You know, we look at what happened with the Nazi Germany, and it's sort of a compressed time of what has happened to humanity. There's a God. And he looks at the mess and he says, I'll cover their shame. I'll protect their lives. I will make a promise. I just want 1 more. Just 1 more. Just 1 more. I know what I'll do. I'll give the very best. No half measures. I'll pay the ultimate price. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no story in the world like the story of redemption. None. And it can be yours. And I don't know that it is yours. You're still east. You've not come into the community. You may think there's still something I've got to do. There's a question I need to have answered. There's a step I need to take. And I just want to tell you this morning, on the authority of the Bible and my own personal experience and the witness that I've had for hundreds and hundreds of people, is there's nothing you need to do. Nothing you need to do. It's already been done. The penalty, the payment has already been paid. It comes down to this. Do you want that gift? Do you want it? Or do you still want to fight the fight you're fighting? Do you want freedom? Or do you still want to be the God of your world and take care of your needs yourself? Do you want to be redeemed? Because if you decide the rest of this life that you will not be, and like Cain, you get on a path that leads to destruction, it changes nothing. He still died for you, whether you accept it or not. He still died. And maybe he's saying to you right now today, whatever the mess is, why don't you just trade it in? Trade your old heart in for a new. Why don't you come into the Redemption Center? Because not only is he in the miracle-making business still, he still redeems. And he's ready to do that today. all you got to do is say, save me, Lord. Let's pray together.
This sermon audio is brought to you by Restoration Church, Mukilteo. If you'd like to find more information about our church and who we are, please visit us at restorationchurchmukilteo.com or email us if you have any questions at info@restorationchurchmukilteo.com. Thanks for listening and have a great